Welcome to Class 10 for Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we'll be continuing our discussion of diagramming, although looking at poetry instead of prose. So let's dive in. Just a reminder that the diagram is not an outline. Instead, it is a depiction and a picture of the structure. Not a flow of thought, but a flow of the actual clauses of the chapter or verse or even the paragraph. It's also exhaustive in that everything in the section that we are studying needs to go in the diagram, demonstrating where it goes and how it relates to every other part. Also, there are no rules for this diagram other than it must be clear and it must be exhaustive. This is intended to be an aid for you as the exegete to show you what questions you need to ask, what questions need to be answered in terms of structure and the actual way the verse or paragraph holds together, and then a reflection of that information to whoever may be reading your exegesis. Since we are switching our focus to the poetry books instead of the prose books, remember that the Hebrew accents, especially the disjunctives, within the three, Job, Psalms, and Proverbs, are different than in prose. We have segolta, which divides the first section into different sections, sinor, which divides segolta sections into smaller, ravias, which function very much like tifka, a slight division, although in some verses, if it is a short verse, a major division, and then dekhi, which divides atnak sections. Again, ol vayorid is the most common division of verses, as you'll remember from the prose section, as well as atnak, although ol vayorid actually takes the priority over atnak in the poetry. Our example text today will be from Psalm 23. This is a well-known text, which is why I picked it, but it also has a number of structural issues that will be revealed in our diagram. Also keep in mind that in poetry, the main verbs are not always vayiktol's, although Psalm 23 does seem to have its fair share of imperfects, but instead the consecutive form that's most emphasized is the vakatal. This doesn't really affect our understanding of Psalm 23 because there's very few consecutives in terms of the flow of thought in Psalm 23, but it's at least something to keep in mind, that poetry emphasizes the perfect converted rather than the imperfect converted. We still, though, look for change of speakers and audience, subject, and verb tense within the verb to indicate where the divisions in the structure might be, as well as the introduction of various clauses, either parataxic or ascendetic, or having key clauses or a share or any other introductory word within the text. These will be our markers to show us where we should consider dividing up the passage. Psalm 23 begins simply enough, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The question, though, is how do these two relate to each other? It would appear that "I shall not want" flows from "The Lord is my shepherd," so we could almost insert a perhaps imaginary "thus" in between "The Lord is my shepherd, thus I shall not want." The question, though, is how does this relate to the rest of the chapter? Verse 2 says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside still waters." I've reversed the flow of thought, though, because the verb actually comes second. In green pastures, he makes me lie down. Beside still waters, he leads me. What is the relationship between these two and "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want"? It's possible that "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want" is its own independent summary thought, very much the way Genesis 1:1 operated. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2 beginning a whole new thought. However, I have diagrammed this as though "in green pastures he makes me lie down, and beside still waters he leads me" are explanations of why I do not want, because the Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, thus I shall not want, because, or let me explain how he's my shepherd, in green pastures, beside still waters, etc. Verse 3 continues the thought of verse 1 of how the Lord is my shepherd. He's my shepherd because my soul he restores, emphasizing the idea of a cast sheep, where sheep will roll over on their back. They'll die in that condition, so they have to be set back on their feet. They have to be restored, although here it's my soul that he restores, again putting what is restored first and the verb second. But the second half of verse 3 puts the verb first rather than the end of verse 3, "in paths of righteousness, and for his name's sake might be expected first," but instead he has the verb first. We might look at this and wonder why the pattern works in this particular way. The reason is because David is a poet, And when poets are writing poetry, they may establish a pattern, but then they deliberately violate their own pattern in order to demonstrate their creativity and their prowess as a poet. So in this particular case, David has established a pattern and then changes it in the last phrase. This phrase is not a separate thought. It continues the thought of the Lord is my shepherd. He's just simply flipping it for emphasis. Verse 4 leads us to some odd structural questions. In verses 1 through 3, we were speaking in the third person. The Lord is my shepherd. He leads me. He restores me. He leads me. He makes me lie down. You'll notice, of course, there that we have a repetition. He makes me, he leads me, he restores me, he leads me, where leads me is the second verb in each clause. We'll also notice, though, that the audience has changed. Instead of it being a third person, the Lord is my shepherd, he is my shepherd, here's my response. Now we have I will fear no evil, and the direct address to God. You are with me, your rod and staff comfort me. The concessive clause, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, suggests that verse 4 should be set off from verses 1 through 3, although it's also possible to structure this as I shall not want. Why? The Lord is my shepherd. Here are the ways he is my shepherd. And then verse 4, I will fear no evil. Why? Because, and here the direct address, you are with me. When we diagram the verse this way, we begin to realize that there are two aspects that are being described here. David's not wanting or not lacking anything, and his not fearing evil. One is in the third person, one is in the second person. But the second person, again, emphasizes that switch that now we're on to a new topic, the fearing of evil. By structuring the verse this way, we're able to understand those two main points and how they relate to one another. Verse 5 continues the direct address from verse 4. You prepare a table, he says, for me, in the presence of my enemies. However, the analogy seems to have shifted a little bit in that verse 4 talked about the rod and the staff of the shepherd. Here we have a table being prepared, which seems to have little to do with sheep. However, I am of the opinion that David has not abandoned the sheep imagery. Instead, I think David is being ironic on purpose, because sheep don't eat at tables, and yet that's exactly what God has done. God has prepared a table for the sheep in the presence of all the wolves, preparing a table for David in the presence of all of his enemies. We have two additional clauses in verse 5 that pose some difficulty. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies is followed by, you anoint my head with oil and my cup overflows. You anoint my head with oil and my cup overflows are both perfect verbs, whereas you prepare a table for me is actually an imperfect. You will prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. So how are we supposed to take two perfects coming after an imperfect? Are we supposed to take them as past events? You have anointed my head with oil, since David is king, and my cup has overflowed, and continues to do so, in a true sense of the perfect, past events having a present impact? Or are we supposed to see these as continuing the thought of the imperfect, almost serving as consecutive forms, even though they're not actually vocatals, but just katal verbs? The interesting part about this interpretation is that the same thing happens in verse 3, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me, and yet your rod and your staff comfort me are imperfects, speaking ahead to the future. They will comfort me. So it's interesting that in verse 5, David would follow up his imperfect with two perfects, whereas in verse 3, he follows up the initial imperfect, I will fear no evil, with another imperfect, because your rod and your staff will comfort me. Why does he not use imperfects in verse 5 if he's intending these to be understood as simultaneous or consecutive events? This seems to suggest that verse 5b should be taken as a completely different idea, a past tense idea. These things have happened or are happening now and will continue to happen in the future, but they have already started. Whereas the preparing a table for me seems to be something that will take place in the future, something that has not yet happened. So we would diagram this accordingly with a space in between in the presence of my enemies before the you anoint my head with oil to show that these are separate. The final verse of this psalm, verse 6, has two more imperfects. They will follow and I will dwell. These connect very well to the rest of the imperfects that we have seen in this verse. I shall not want, I fear no evil, you will prepare, and then they will follow and I will dwell. However, you'll notice that as much as these are futures, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever is the only one that has to do with eternity. They will follow all the days of my life has to do with now and following. And so it is possible to say in verse 5, you will prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, that this is something that is already happening and will continue to happen into the future. Rather than viewing it as a perfect of something that is already done and will continue to happen, this is something that is not yet done but will continue to happen. You will prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. So David may be speaking of future deliverance here in this lifetime, but it's also possible that he is looking to eternity so that we would connect verse 5 with that final imperfect, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. One of the nice things about a diagram is that we don't have to necessarily answer all of those interpretive questions in terms of meaning. We're just simply diagramming the verse. So while we may have to ask ourselves how we diagram the two perfects in verse 5, we don't really have to answer the question of timing for verse 5 until later on in the exegetical process. For now, it's enough to say that you will prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies is an imperfect, as is, they will follow and I will dwell, so that it is still a main idea. The real question in terms of a structure is, do we have 5 main imperfect verbs that need to be diagrammed, or 5 main perfect verbs plus 2 perfects carrying the idea of the you will prepare? That's the question that needs to be asked in a diagram, whereas the other question as to you will prepare, when will you prepare, is an exegetical, hermeneutical, interpretive question, not something necessarily that has to be reflected in a diagram, but at least a question that we have raised because of the diagram, even if it's not answered here. I'm not going to mention accents in this particular lecture, although I've already introduced them, because the accents don't really make a difference in Psalm 23. They're exactly where we would expect them. All the major divisions that we've already made, naturally, are the places where we find the disjunctive accents. So it's not really worth mentioning, other than saying that the disjunctive accents confirm our understanding of the structure of this verse. So as we conclude, let me again say the value of a diagram is that it raises for us the exegetical questions in terms of structure that need to be answered and in terms of syntax, and it also gives us an easy way to demonstrate the answers to those questions once we have established them. Thus, diagram is an important part of our understanding of a verse, raising those questions, answering those questions, and then putting them in a structural diagram to remind us later of how we understood the syntax of the verse. Well, that concludes our time in Psalm 23 and our lecture for this particular lesson. Reminder to keep working on your final exegetical paper as well as the text for our next class time. Make sure you're continuing to refresh your vocabulary and reviewing the contents of each of these lectures, as you'll need to be using them on your final paper, and I will see you in class.